Yes, Pokemon. Who the hell doesn't know the series? I have no idea why, but the anime is still a hit today, and the same applies to the games. Pokemon was huge decades ago and even today still is a superstar. It all started with Pokemon Red and Green. We know Red, somewhat, but Green is exclusive to Japan. But then Pokemon Blue hit the scene. However, in Europe, Pokemon Red and Blue did not happen until 1999, 3 years after the release in Japan. What you are seeing here is my copy of Pokemon Blue that I got in the year 2000 for the Game Boy, and yes, it still works fine. It is also the very Pokemon game I ever finished with all 151 Pokemon. Yes, also with Mew, and yes, you can catch it in this game. Hands up if you still remember the good old Game Boy. Pokemon Crystal was released in Japan in the year 2000, but we didn't get it until 2001 for the Game Boy Color, and yes, that's my still fully functional copy I've owned for over 20 years. The last time I played Crystal was in the year 2003, so good 20 years ago. I'm telling you all of this because although the series is still a big hit worldwide, I have not played any other game of the franchise after Crystal. I also gave up the anime around 10 years ago or something, with the end of Pokemon Best Wishes. We know it as Pokemon Black and White. So almost 20 years should be enough time to improve the series on every aspect, right? Making real progress, especially since it's on the Nintendo Switch. Because I wanted to see how the series developed, I bought a used copy of Pokemon Shield to see what is actually going on. Well, Pokemon Shield may not be the best game in the modern era series, but it should have done enough to outshine Blue and Crystal. At least that's what I thought. Well, I don't want to say that Shield absolutely sucks, but for a newcomer like me who is touching a Pokemon game again after 20 years, yeah, I am very disappointed. Let me put it this way. Pokemon is meant for children, and that's not the problem because I took that into account. I also took into account the fact that the Pokemon formula just works. You know, that formula of catching Pokemon and stuff. So as long as it's not broken, then you don't need to fix it, right? However, if you have this formula, but everything around the formula is not all that good, then the formula on its own does not help much, and that's my main problem with Pokemon Shield. So let's talk about this formula and then about everything around it. The formula is simple. You are a young man who dreams of becoming the best Pokemon trainer, gets his first Pokemon from some professor, and then sets off. You discover, fight, catch and train Pokemon, fighting 1v1 battles against wild Pokemon or other trainers, and that's basically it until you are champion. There is nothing wrong with this formula. The fact that there are so many Pokemon to discover automatically encourages exploration, and that's what makes the series great. In itself, I like it when games encourage exploration because then there is a reason to see absolutely everything the game has to offer. Or almost. However, the problem is everything around the formula. Well, okay, not everything, but quite a few things. Let's stick with the Pokemon themselves. From my point of view, this is also a reason why I gave the game series up after Crystal and the anime series after Best Wishes. With each new generation, for the most part the Pokemon look worse and worse. Sure, the creatures themselves have never been just a simple animal since Generation 1, but often a mix of several animals. like Butterfree looks like a butterfly, and Beedrill is clearly a bee. Arbok is a cobra, read his name backwards, and Rapidash is a fire horse. Blastoise is practically a big turtle with 2 cannons, which is actually kinda cool. Arcanine is a mix of a dog, tiger and lion, which is also kinda cool. Or Dugong is a seal. But sure, even in Generation 1 there were the strange ones like Jinx or Porygon, but even they looked like something and weren't too experimental. But now, I was often shocked when I saw these examples. Really? But, well, let's leave the designs aside because they are less of a problem. We have Pokemon on a Switch and everything is in 3D, which is perfectly fine and expected. But for a team that has been working on Pokemon for decades, like Gamefreak and even Nintendo, the expressions and reactions of the Pokemon themselves are very limited. Sure, you can see how happy the Pokemon are when you go camping or how they get serious when you play with them, but that's all standard and nothing more. For example, as soon as I had a Growlithe, I used it often, especially because I wanted to have the cool Arcanine as my main Pokemon. I have also fought other Growlithes here and there, but almost all Pokemon show visually absolutely no reaction when their energy is on red like here. Growlithe's facial expression is always the same as is his position. If the HP is red, why doesn't he get on his knees, show signs of exertion, signs of injury or something similar? These are details that should have existed in the series already. But there are minimal exceptions here and there, like my Corviknight. If his HP is red, then he flutters his wings around slightly slower. Even on yellow, he does that. These are small details that you should see in every Pokemon, but only the very few have it. And before you bring the massive number of Pokemon as an excuse, Pokemon Shield only has 400 Pokemon total, excluding DLC. Thus, Gamefreak is just lazy. The fights themselves are also not impressive and do little that is new or even good. The 1 vs 1 fights are normal and expected, but there are also 2 against 2 fights, but they do not happen very often. In addition, there is Dynamax that lets you and the opposing Pokemon turn into giants for 3 rounds, but only in Poké Stadiums or places where it is allowed, and I don't really know what to make of it. However, I tend to be rather negative towards it. Because in the end, what does Dynamax do? Your Pokemon will get bigger, stronger and get max attacks for 3 rounds. Okay, on the one hand, you don't know when the opponent will use Dynamax, so you have to be able to anticipate it and be ready when something like that happens. The fact that almost all Pokemon can Dynamax enables the usage of even the creatures rarely anybody uses. In that regard, Dynamax is actually fine. However, the problem is that Dynamax is too powerful and brings hardly any variation. It is too powerful because in general, normal-sized Pokemon will either lose immediately or lose a lot of HP too often, even though the Dynamax Pokemon has no elemental advantage over the opponent. You know, like water versus fire and stuff, where fire obviously loses. As a result, as soon as one goes Dynamax, the other one is practically forced to go Dynamax as well, to just not die. Sure, if you are overpowered, like I usually was, not always on purpose, then this becomes less of a problem, but in terms of competition like online matches in 1 vs 1, in 2 vs 2 it's okay because those are teams against each other and strategy is the norm. But that's also the problem. Dynamax seems to be a system that appears to be halfway balanced in 2 vs 2, but absolutely broken in 1 vs 1. But in story mode, although there are 2 vs 2 fights, but never you alone against 2 opponents, Dynamax is not used at all. In fact, Dynamax only happens in the arenas, and it offers hardly any variation because in the end there is not only a very limited number of attacks for all Pokemon, but almost all max attacks are just that, attacks. There are actually only 19 max attacks for all 400 Pokemon, because the max attacks are based on the elements of the individual attacks rather than the individual attacks themselves. You can see an example right here. My Arcanine has 2 fire attacks that do not have the same strength and thus do not the same damage, but with Dynamax both attacks become the same. Why? And yes, there is hardly any Dynamax defense, as if the system is only there to carry out attacks. All this not only limits the variation very strongly, but because the system is only intended for attacks, any strategy is largely lost. Any kind of strategy is reduced to, if you attack first, you win. Nah, absolutely not my thing. Sure, there is also Gigantamax, which is slightly stronger than Dynamax for some reason, but while most Pokemon can Dynamax, only a very small fraction can Gigantamax. I mean, why? Either let all Pokemon only Dynamax or only Gigantamax, but do not introduce both, let's call them systems. That is way too overkill and pointless, especially when Gigantamax is obviously always the better option. But at least the Pokemon look a bit different when they Gigantamax, while they only get bigger when they Dynamax. Apparently previous Pokemon titles also had other gimmicks like Mega Evolutions and Z attacks or something, but I have no idea about it because, like I said, this is my very first Pokemon since Pokemon Crystal, and in Crystal there was none of it. I think it was just much better to play Pokemon without such gimmicks. But I mean, on the one hand, I understand that the developers want or even have to introduce new ideas, like Dynamax or Mega Evolutions, but on the other hand, if the core formula works well, then it doesn't need extra gimmicks, especially not if the gimmicks themselves that they are implementing do not work well or are simply bad. And by being more concerned with introducing new gimmicks that don't work well, Gamefreak ignored other elements of the series that were in dire need of improvement, such as the aforementioned animations of the Pokemon. But let's move to other things. Well, Pokemon Crystal was on the Game Boy Color, so it was graphically limited and certainly not in 3D. It would be amazing if it were, but it was still a glorious game. So I was very curious to see how such a game and world would look like in 3D, and in the end, I was rather disappointed because it does certain key things worse than Crystal or even Blue. Here's the thing, the world itself is okay. Some large fields, weather change, day-night cycle, Pokemon that appear depending on the weather and time of day, you can see all Pokemon running around and thus the battles are not random, etc. On the floor you will find Pokeballs that have different items in it, or if there is a simple spot that flashes, then that is also an item. If you shake trees, then you get fruits, but watch out, because if you shake too often, then a wild Pokemon will appear. However, although the fields are in 3D, large and partially wide, they somehow manage to feel empty and, for lack of a better word, meaningless. For example, remember the caves in Pokemon Blue that were sometimes structured like a maze? Or the cave where you needed light to trespass it, and if you didn't have it, you could still try to cross the cave in the dark if you were brave. Pokemon Blue has used some of its own fields or sections or whatever you want to call it to introduce the player to a puzzle or obstacle that needed to be solved. But there's absolutely none of that in Shield. Not only are there hardly any caves, there are little to no puzzles here. In addition, there are hardly any hidden meaningful objects, and therefore you have no reason to revisit the fields again. Well, except for catching Pokemon, of course. And with hardly any hidden things, I mean examples like in Pokemon Blue and the famous truck, or the high number of hidden items that are actually hidden. Do you remember how your Pokemon could or even had to use certain HMs in Pokemon Blue so that you could get ahead in the game, like flying, surfing, cutting, etc.? They are all gone here. Here you get absolutely everything served in a silver platter. Almost from the very beginning you can fly anywhere as long as you've been there already. You will never need surfing because your bike can ride over water later on. Cutting is not needed at all, etc. Why did Gamefreak throw away the puzzle aspect of Pokemon? You also get the bike gifted to you just like that. The problem with all this is that as a player you have earned nothing. You don't have to worry, you don't have to work for anything. You just get everything served as if the game were in ultra easy mode, and thus it loses a very important aspect that made the earlier Pokemon games special: sense of achievement. Other than enslaving all Pokemon, I mean owning, of course, obviously, Shield has absolutely no sense of achievement even if you become champion. And this problem gets increased because the whole game is incredibly simple and easy. Well, okay, don't get me wrong, I have no problem with Pokemon being an easy game. After all, the target audience are kids. However, if the game is too simple and easy, like here, basically giving you zero challenge, then not only does the game look like cheap stuff, but you also have nothing to gain from playing it when much better and more satisfying titles are out there. Again, in my opinion, like Pokemon Blue and Crystal. The goal of a game is not only to introduce a world to you with its characters and story, the goal is also for you to learn. Good games give the player obstacles that he has to overcome by learning to exploit all the possibilities he has at his disposal. Like the aforementioned Dark Cave in Pokemon Blue. You can be brave and try to cross it in the dark. And yes, it was actually pitch black. Or you can try to find another way, like getting light. As well, the bike. You only got it if you talked to a specific person, got a bike coupon, and you would have to exchange it for the bike in a different city. And if I remember correctly, you can beat the game without even getting the bike at all. But point is, getting all these things requires exploration, it demands the brain cells, it tests the player's patience, it challenges the player in every way, and that's a good thing if the challenge is well balanced. But if you give the player everything without him having to work, fight or explore for it, then the point of the game is gone. And children in particular need the challenge to grow. Sure, in Shield you only get the bike if you defeat villains in Route 5, but that's the problem, you actually have to defeat those villains anyway. Thus the bike is no longer an option, but a must. When I talked about Driver for the PlayStation 1 a while ago, do you remember the first mission in the garage? This has challenged the player, and who does not know this feeling of relief and accomplishment when you finally made it? Because you finally won, because you've learned not to give up, because you've learned to adapt to the situation, you grew as a person and as a player. None of that is in Shield, because Shield is mostly so brainless that nobody gets anything out of it. The series was never known for its high quality story. Okay, let's face it. The story in Pokemon is practically as simple as that of a porn. The story is usually just become a Pokemon champion and that's it. Yeah, there is the plot here with the legendary Pokemon, but you are permanently forced not to care about it because the champion Leon constantly says, don't worry about it, and therefore you simply don't care. Only towards the end you are forced to actually care about the legend, but as soon as that time comes, not only is the player, or you, already disinterested, but if you pay close attention to it, then the story outside of being champion is pointless. Because what does it boil down to? A guy wants to start an apocalypse to save the world from a catastrophe. That will happen in 1,000 years. Do you see the problem here? If the catastrophe won't happen for another 1,000 years, why does anyone have to worry about it right now? And starting an apocalypse one way or another leads to a catastrophe. Thus he wants to start one disaster long before a completely different one begins. But even if you defeat him, his reaction is just, okay. I have to mention Pokemon Blue again. In Pokemon Blue, the goal was not only to become champion, but there were also Team Rocket and Giovanni who wanted to use Pokemon for evil, and you needed to stop them. It wasn't complex, but at least it made sense, and it was clear from the beginning what they wanted, because they were an obstacle almost from the very start. But in Shield? There are more mindless dialogues, like with the president's assistants who will stop everyone who stands in the president's way, but then she plays a game of catch with you for some reason. Dude, Gamefreak doesn't seem to care about children or their own fans when they present this kind of story in quotations. When I finally finished the game, I asked myself if the story was supposed to be a parody or something. But other elements of the game are also weak. Let's start with the graphics. This looks like an early PS3 game, if anything. Well, okay, Pokemon doesn't have to look like Astral Chain or Zelda, but really? 20 years not playing anything from the series and that's all Pokemon has to offer? Guys, we are on the Nintendo Switch, which may not be able to compete with a PS4 in terms of power, but still it can do far more than what we can see here. But the colors are strong, no doubt. Very colorful indeed, but sometimes it's a bit over the top. The characters, just like the Pokemon, show hardly any emotion, however. Their basic facial expression hardly changes for any reason, and it goes so far that, for example, your rival Hop is in a tight spot, but he still grins around like an idiot for the most part. Never mind your character that has just a few basic expressions and nothing else. But it's also disturbing how much the game holds your hands. I've already touched on some things like the skills and the bike, but the overall difficulty of the game is a joke. In the single player, you hardly need a strategy because there is hardly any challenge. The fact that absolutely all Pokemon in the team get EXP, even if they did not participate in the battle, gives the player no reason to grind. Even being underpowered is hardly a problem because the enemies are so easy. Well, maybe outside when they Dynamax. Okay, you know what? The video is already long enough and I don't want to analyze everything, but point is, for someone that last played a Pokemon game 20 years ago, I can only be more than disappointed. Sure, catching and training Pokemon is still a lot of fun. But if that's all this series has to offer today, then I would rather stick with Pokemon Blue and Crystal. But you may have noticed one thing. I practically did not mention the online mode. That's because I am not interested in it. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not, I don't know. In the end though, I don't care about online, but if it's good and Gamefreak preferred to focus on that mode alone instead of having a good single player alongside a good online mode, then Gamefreak has lost sight of what's actually important here.